There are wounds that time alone cannot heal, aching spaces in our hearts that we've learned to carry in silence. Sometimes it takes the smallest hand slipping into ours to show us that love can still find its way through even the deepest grief. When 70-year-old Jakob agreed to watch little Hannah during her mother's hospital stay, he thought he was simply helping a neighbor in need, never imagining this silent 4-year-old would lead him to a truth that would change everything he believed about his past. Hannah rarely spoke, but she had a way of wandering down forgotten paths with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where she was going. On this particular afternoon, she stopped in front of an abandoned cabin deep in the woods, pointing at something only she could see. Inside that crumbling shelter, Jakob discovered an old photograph that would shatter 30 years of carefully constructed solitude. But was this mysterious child really leading him to his own granddaughter? Or was grief playing tricks on an old man's heart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Lancaster County like a familiar shawl, wrapping the farmland in the kind of quiet that Jakob Stoltzfus had come to both cherish and fear. 3 years had passed since Sarah's funeral. 3 years since the last voice that truly knew him had fallen silent. And still, he found himself setting 2 cups on the kitchen table each dawn, before remembering he would drink his coffee. Alone, his calloused fingers traced the smooth edges of the wooden cross he'd carved during those long nights when sleep eluded him. A simple thing, no bigger than his palm, whittled from the oak tree where he'd proposed to Sarah 42 years ago. The cross had been her final request, something to hold when the pain became too much to bear. Now it was his anchor, the only thing that kept him tethered to a faith that felt as weathered as the barn siding outside his window. Jakob had always been a man of few words, but since Sarah's passing, silence had become his constant companion. The other men in his district, Bishop Samuel, his neighbor Eli, even his closest friend Aaron, spoke to him with the careful gentleness reserved for the walking wounded. They meant well, these good people who shared his beliefs and his bloodline, but their sympathy felt like stones in his pockets, weighing him down when what he needed was to feel weightless again. The knock on his door came at 7:30. Precisely when he'd finished his second cup of coffee and was contemplating the fields that stretched beyond his porch. Ruth Henderson stood on his doorstep, her face pale beneath the fluorescent hospital bracelet that circled her thin wrist. She clutched the hand of a small girl who couldn't have been more than 4 years old, a child with dark hair that caught the morning light and eyes that seemed to hold secrets too heavy for such a young soul. "Jakob," Ruth said, her voice carrying the weight of desperation, poorly disguised as politeness. "I'm so sorry to bother you this early, but I didn't know where else to turn." He'd known Ruth for 5 years, ever since she'd moved into the small English house that bordered his property. She was a widow herself, perhaps 55, with the kind of quiet dignity that reminded him of his own Sarah. She'd lost her husband to cancer the year before Sarah died, and they'd shared the odd comfort of 2 people who understood grief's particular geography. "The doctors want to run more tests," Ruth continued, glancing down at the child who remained perfectly still beside her. "My heart, well, it's not what it used to be, and they're talking about surgery. Maybe a longer stay than I initially thought." She paused, searching his face for some sign of understanding. "Hannah here, she's my granddaughter. Well, step-granddaughter, really. Her mother passed 2 years ago, and there's no one else." Jakob looked down at the child named Hannah. She wore a simple blue dress and small leather shoes that had seen better days. Her hair was braided neatly, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face. What struck him most was her stillness, not the fidgety quiet of a child forced to behave, but the profound silence of someone who'd learned that words often brought more trouble than comfort. "She's very quiet," Ruth said, as if reading his thoughts. "Hasn't said much since her mama died. But she's good, Jakob. She won't be any trouble, I promise." She just needs someone to watch over her while I'm in the hospital." The request hung in the morning air between them like a prayer waiting for an answer. Jakob had never had children. That was one of the sorrows he and Sarah had learned to carry together. They'd tried for years, hoping and praying through seasons of disappointment until they'd finally accepted that some gifts weren't meant for them. Looking at Hannah now, he felt an unfamiliar stirring in his chest, something that might have been longing or might have been fear. "How long?" he asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "The doctors aren't sure. Could be a week, could be longer. I know it's asking a lot, especially with you being—" She stopped herself, clearly aware that mentioning his recent widowhood would only make the request more difficult. Jakob studied the child again. Hannah looked up at him with those serious dark eyes, and for just a moment he could have sworn he saw something familiar in her face, a recognition that made no sense but felt true nonetheless. "She can stay," he heard himself say, though he hadn't consciously made the decision. "Until you're better." Ruth's relief was immediate and overwhelming. "Oh, Jakob, thank you. I've brought her things, clothes, her favorite blanket, some books. She likes to walk outside, and she's fascinated by woodworking. She'll sit for hours watching anyone work with their hands." As Ruth gathered Hannah's belongings from her car, Jakob knelt down to the child's level. Up close, he could see that her eyes weren't just dark, but held flecks of gold that reminded him of autumn leaves. There was something else too, a quality of attention that seemed unusual in someone so young, as if she was constantly observing and cataloguing the world around her for reasons he couldn't begin to understand. "Hello, Hannah," he said gently. "Would you like to see where you'll be staying?" She nodded once, a small, precise movement that somehow conveyed both consent and wariness. When Ruth kissed her goodbye, promising to return as soon as the doctors would allow, Hannah didn't cry or cling. She simply watched the car disappear down the gravel drive with the same serious attention she seemed to give everything else. Jakob's house was sparse by most standards, functional furniture built to last, minimal decoration, and the kind of cleanliness that came from having too much time and too little purpose. But as he showed Hannah to the spare room where she'd sleep, he noticed her eyes taking in details, the way the morning light fell across the hardwood floors, the quilts his Sarah had made that still hung on wooden racks, the workshop visible through the kitchen window where he spent most of his days now. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Though it was barely past breakfast time, Hannah shook her head but continued to study his face with that unnerving intensity. It occurred to Jakob that perhaps she was trying to determine whether he could be trusted, whether this strange arrangement would bring her comfort or simply another kind of uncertainty. The first few hours passed quietly. Hannah sat at his kitchen table while he went about his morning routine, checking on the chickens, inspecting the small vegetable garden Sarah had loved, organizing tools in his workshop. Through the window, he could see her watching his movements, her small hands folded in her lap, her expression thoughtful rather than bored. It wasn't until after lunch that something shifted between them. Jakob had been working on a simple birdhouse, letting the familiar rhythm of planning and shaping wood settle his nerves, when he noticed Hannah standing in the workshop doorway. She didn't ask to come in, just observed from the threshold as he smoothed the rough edges with sandpaper. "Would you like to see?" he asked, holding up the piece he'd been working on. She stepped forward carefully, as if entering sacred space, and examined his work with the kind of serious attention he might expect from a fellow craftsman. When she reached out one small finger to trace the grain of the wood, Jakob felt something unlock in his chest, a door he'd kept carefully sealed since Sarah's death. "My wife used to say that wood remembers everything," he told her. Though he wasn't sure why he was sharing this. Every season it grew, every storm it weathered. When you work with it, you're working with all that memory. Hannah looked up at him then, and for the first time since Ruth had brought her to his door, she smiled. It was just a small curve of her lips, but it transformed her entire face. revealing the child beneath the too serious expression she usually wore that evening. As Jacob prepared a simple dinner of bread and soup, he found himself talking to Hannah more than he'd spoken aloud in months. She didn't respond with words, but her presence felt different from the crushing silence he'd grown accustomed to. When she helped him set the table, carefully placing the wooden cross beside his plate as if she understood its importance, he realized that perhaps Ruth had done him as much of a favor as he was doing her. Later that night, after Hannah had gone to bed clutching her worn blanket, Jakob sat on his porch and listened to the familiar sounds of evening settling over the countryside. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, he didn't feel completely alone. There was someone else in his house, someone whose breathing he could hear through the thin walls, someone who might need him in ways he was only beginning to understand. He pulled the wooden cross from his pocket and held it up to catch the last light of day. Sarah would have loved Hannah, he thought. She would have known exactly how to reach past the child's careful silence to the bright spirit underneath. Maybe in some way he couldn't yet comprehend. She was still helping him figure it out. 3 days into their quiet coexistence, Hannah did something that changed everything. Jakob had grown comfortable with their morning routine, coffee for himself, warm milk for her, a shared breakfast eaten in companionable silence while the sun climbed over the eastern hills. Hannah seemed content to shadow his daily activities, watching him tend to small repairs around the farm with the patience of someone who found meaning in observing rather than participating. She rarely wandered far from his sight, which made her sudden disappearance from the workshop all the more startling. He'd been absorbed in fitting joints for a cabinet door when he realized the small presence that had become familiar was no longer beside him. The workshop felt different without her quiet attention, emptier in a way that made his chest tighten with unexpected worry. "Hannah?" he called, stepping outside into the afternoon warmth. The yard appeared empty, save for the chickens pecking at scattered grain near their coop. "Hannah, where are you?" A flutter of blue caught his eye near the tree line, the same shade as the dress she'd worn that first morning. She stood at the edge of the woods that bordered his property, about 30 yards from the house, perfectly still as always, but facing the shadowed path that led deeper into the forest. Jakob approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. As he drew closer, he could see that she wasn't simply standing idle. She was studying something, her head tilted in that way that meant she was working through a problem only she could understand. "What is it?" he asked gently when he reached her side. Instead of answering, not that he'd expected words, Hannah began walking down the narrow path that wound between the maple and oak trees. Her steps were deliberate, unhurried, as if she were following directions only she could hear. Jakob hesitated for a moment, then followed, his work boots crunching softly on the carpet of fallen leaves. The path was one he knew well, though he hadn't walked it in years. It led to a small clearing about half a mile into the woods, where an old cabin sat slowly surrendering to time and weather. He'd stumbled across it during his courting days with Sarah, back when walking these woods had been about escape rather than avoidance. The structure had been abandoned even then, probably built by some long-forgotten settler who'd given up on the dream of carving civilization from wilderness. Hannah moved with surprising confidence for someone who'd never explored these woods before, at least not to his knowledge. She didn't pause at the forks in the path or seem confused by the way the trees created shadows that could easily mislead someone unfamiliar with the terrain. Instead, she walked as if she'd made this journey many times before, her small hand occasionally reaching out to touch the rough bark of particular trees as if greeting old friends. When they reached the clearing, Jakob's breath caught in his throat. The cabin looked even more decrepit than he remembered. Roof partially collapsed, walls weathered to silver grey, windows long since claimed by ivy and time. But Hannah walked straight to the front door, or what remained of it, and stood waiting as if she expected him to open it for her. "I don't think we should go inside," Jakob said, noting the way the porch sagged under the weight of accumulated debris. "It's not safe." Hannah turned to look at him with those serious dark eyes, then pointed at the door with the kind of insistence he hadn't seen from her before. There was something in her expression, not stubbornness exactly, but a quiet certainty that made him reconsider his caution. The door hung askew on its hinges, allowing enough space for them to squeeze through without putting full weight on the compromised structure. Inside, filtered sunlight revealed a single room that had once been someone's entire world. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney reaching toward the partially collapsed roof. What might have been furniture was now just shapes under decades of dust and debris. Hannah walked directly to the far corner of the room, where a wooden crate sat beneath the one window that still held most of its glass. She pointed at the crate, then looked at Jakob expectantly. "You want me to look in there?" he asked. She nodded once, that same precise movement he was learning to recognize as her clearest form of communication. Jakob approached the crate carefully, testing the floorboards with each step. The wood felt solid enough beneath the layer of dirt and leaves that had blown in through gaps in the walls. When he knelt beside the crate and lifted its warped lid, his heart nearly stopped. Inside, wrapped in what had once been white cloth but was now yellowed with age, lay a photograph. Even before he unwrapped it completely, Jakob recognized the quality of the paper. The thick, glossy finish that photographers had used in the 1990s, back when every picture was precious because each one cost money to develop. The image revealed itself slowly as he peeled away the protective fabric. Two people stood beside what looked like a carnival game booth, their faces bright with the kind of laughter that comes from being young and foolish and completely in love. The woman had dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and eyes that sparkled with mischief. The man beside her, his arm wrapped around her waist, looked like Jakob, but a Jakob from 30 years ago, before responsibility had settled into the lines around his eyes, before grief had taught him to carry himself more carefully through the world. Rebecca. Her name hit him like cold water, bringing with it a flood of memories he'd spent decades trying to forget. Rebecca Mitchell, the English girl he'd met during his Rumspringa, the time when young Amish men and women were allowed to experience the outside world before committing to their faith. She'd worked at the county fair that summer, operating the ring toss game, where he'd won her a stuffed elephant that she'd named Horatio. She'd thought that was the most hilarious thing in the world, giving a dignified name to a cheap carnival prize. They'd spent 3 months together that summer. 3 months when Jakob had seriously considered leaving his community for good. Rebecca had introduced him to movies and restaurants, to music that wasn't hymns and books that weren't scripture. She'd shown him a world where choices weren't predetermined by tradition and where love didn't have to fit into carefully defined categories. But autumn had come, as it always did, and with it the pressure to return home. Bishop Samuel had made it clear that Jacob's continued absence was causing concern, that his family was worried about his soul, that his community needed him to make his choice. The night before, he'd planned to tell Rebecca he was staying with her. His father had appeared at her apartment door with news that his mother was seriously ill, that she was asking for him, that duty called him home. He'd promised Rebecca he'd return within a week, after he'd sorted out his family obligations. But once he was back in his familiar world, surrounded by the people who'd shaped him and the faith that had anchored his entire life, the English world began to feel like a dream. His mother recovered, his father spoke to him about responsibility and legacy, and the community welcomed him back with the warmth reserved for prodigal sons who'd seen the error of their ways. Jakob had written letters to Rebecca, dozens of them, but had never mailed a single one. What could he say that wouldn't sound like betrayal? How could he explain that he loved her but loved his way of life more? How could he make her understand that choosing her would mean losing everyone else who mattered to him? Eventually he'd stopped writing the letters. Eventually he'd met Sarah, a good Amish woman who shared his faith and his values. Eventually he'd convinced himself that what he'd felt for Rebecca had been infatuation, not love. the kind of confusion that comes from being young and inexperienced in the ways of the heart. But now, holding this photograph in the ruins of an abandoned cabin, with a silent child watching his every reaction, Jakob realized he'd been lying to himself for 3 decades. He remembered taking this picture, remembered the way Rebecca had laughed when the photographer told them to say cheese, remembered how she'd insisted they get copies made, so they'd always have proof of the happiest day of her life. He looked more closely at the photograph, studying details he'd missed in his initial shock. Rebecca's free hand rested on her stomach, and now that he was looking for it, he could see the slightest curve beneath her summer dress, so subtle it could have been the way the fabric fell, except that he knew Rebecca's body as well as he'd known his own that summer. And this was different. Hannah tugged gently at his sleeve, drawing his attention away from the photograph. When he looked down at her, she pointed at the image, then at herself, then back at the image again. Her meaning was unmistakable, impossible, and yet undeniably clear. Jacob's hands began to shake as the full weight of what she was trying to tell him settled into his bones. This child, this serious, silent little girl who'd appeared in his life when he needed her most, was pointing at a photograph of him with a woman he'd loved and abandoned 30 years ago, claiming some connection he was only beginning to understand. The photograph slipped from his trembling fingers and fluttered to the dusty floor, where it landed face up between them like an accusation waiting for an answer. Jakob returned to the cabin the next morning without Hannah. Carrying a flashlight and a crowbar he hoped he wouldn't need to use. Sleep had been impossible after their discovery. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he'd seen Rebecca's face from the photograph, young and radiant and completely unaware of the pain that was coming. He'd also seen Hannah's serious expression as she'd pointed from the image to herself, making a claim that defied everything he thought he knew about his own life. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and his breath formed small clouds as he navigated the familiar path to the clearing. In daylight, the cabin looked even more fragile than it had the afternoon before, as if their brief visit had somehow accelerated its decay. But Jakob was no longer concerned with the building's structural integrity. He was focused on what else it might be. Hiding. He'd spent most of the sleepless night remembering details about Rebecca that he'd successfully buried for decades. The way she'd hummed while she worked, always slightly off-key, but with such joy that it didn't matter. How she'd insisted on reading the newspaper every morning, not just the local sections, but the entire thing, because she said the world was too big to ignore. The conversations they'd had about faith and doubt, tradition and freedom. The kind of deep discussions that had both thrilled and terrified his 19-year-old heart. Most painfully, he remembered their last real conversation, the night before his father had arrived with news of his mother's illness. Rebecca had been unusually quiet during dinner, picking at her food, while he talked about his plans to find work in town, maybe rent a small apartment where they could start building a life together. When he'd finally asked what was wrong, she'd looked at him with an expression he hadn't been able to interpret at the time, but now recognized as fear mixed with hope. Jake, she'd said. She was the only person who'd ever called him. That what if everything changed tomorrow? What if we had to figure out a completely different kind of future than the one we're planning? He'd assumed she was worried about his family's reaction to their relationship, or maybe having second thoughts about dating someone from such a different background. He'd reassured her that love could overcome any obstacle, that they'd face whatever challenges came their way together. But now, 30 years later, standing in the ruins of an abandoned cabin with evidence of his past staring up at him from the dusty floor, Jakob wondered if Rebecca had been trying to tell him something much more specific. The floorboards creaked ominously as he knelt beside the wooden crate where Hannah had led him the day before. This time, he examined its contents more carefully. Beneath where the photograph had lain, wrapped in the same yellowed cloth, he found a small leather journal, bound with a string that had long since lost its original color. Jakob's hands trembled as he untied the string and opened the journal to its first page. Rebecca's handwriting hadn't changed much over the years. He recognized the careful loops and determined slashes that had filled the margins of books she'd lent him. The love letters she'd written when he'd had to return home for weekend obligations to his family. The first entry was dated August 15th, 1994, just 2 weeks after the photograph had been taken. Jake left for home today to see his family. He says he'll be back Sunday, but something in his eyes looked different when he said goodbye. Maybe I'm just being paranoid because of the news, but I keep thinking about the way his whole body changed when I tried to tell him at dinner last night. He got that look he gets when he's trying to solve a problem. And I chickened out before I could get the words out. Dr. Martinez confirmed it yesterday. 8 weeks. I keep staring at myself in the mirror, trying to see some sign of what's happening inside me, but mostly I just look scared. Maybe that's because I am scared. Not of being pregnant. I want this baby more than I've ever wanted anything. But I'm scared of what it means for us. Scared of how Jake will react. Scared that this wonderful thing might be the thing that drives him away. Jakob had to stop reading. His chest felt tight, as if someone had wrapped bands around his ribs and was slowly tightening them. He'd left Rebecca the night after she'd tried to tell him she was pregnant. He'd abandoned her when she'd needed him most. When she'd been carrying his child and trying to find the courage to share the news that would have changed everything. He forced himself to continue reading, though each word felt like a stone dropping into his stomach. August 22nd, 1994, still no word from Jake. His neighbor, Mrs. Yoder, says his mother is doing better, so I don't understand why he hasn't come back or at least called. I drove past the farm twice this week, but couldn't work up the courage to go to the door. What if he's decided he doesn't want this life? What if seeing his family again reminded him of who he really is, and there's no room in that picture for an English girl and her baby? I keep telling myself he just needs time to process everything, but it's been a week since he said he'd be back. How much time does love need? September 1st, 1994, I finally drove to the farm today. His father answered the door, and the way he looked at me, like I was something unclean that had wandered onto his property, told me everything I needed to know. He said Jake had decided to stay home, that he was planning to join the church and marry a good Amish girl, that it would be better for everyone if I stopped trying to contact him. I asked if I could speak to Jake directly, just once, and his father said Jake had asked him to handle this conversation, that Jake wanted me to know he'd appreciated our friendship, but that he'd realized he belonged with his own people. Friendship. 3 months of planning a life together, and his father called it friendship. I didn't tell him about the baby. What would be the point? If Jake can't even face me himself, if he's willing to let his father deliver his rejection like I'm some kind of business transaction he wants to close, then he's already made his choice. And it's not us. Jakob closed the journal and pressed it against his forehead, trying to contain the grief that was threatening to overwhelm him. Rebecca had been pregnant. She'd tried to tell him, had waited for him to come back, had driven to his family's farm looking for answers. And his father had turned her away with lies, had told her Jakob didn't want to see her, when the truth was that Jakob had been forbidden from leaving the farm until he'd committed to staying permanently. But even as anger at his father's deception rose in his throat, Jakob couldn't escape the more uncomfortable truth. He'd made his choice before Rebecca had ever appeared at the farm. He'd chosen the familiar weight of tradition over the uncertain promise of love, chosen the approval of his community over the woman who'd been carrying his child. His father had only delivered the message that Jakob's actions had already written. He opened the journal again, needing to know the rest of Rebecca's story, needing to understand how the silent child in his kitchen could possibly be connected to the woman whose heart he'd broken 3 decades ago. September 15th, 1994. I've decided to name her Sarah if it's a girl. I know that probably sounds crazy, since Sarah was Jake's mother's name, but I can't help thinking that maybe someday she'll want to know something about her father's world. Maybe having a name that would fit there will make her feel less like a mistake and more like a bridge between two different kinds of love. I'm not angry anymore. I was for a while. Furious at Jake for being too cowardly to face me, furious at his father for treating me like I was nothing, furious at myself for believing that love could really conquer everything. But anger takes too much energy, and I need all my strength for this baby. She's going to be beautiful. She's going to be strong. And she's going to know that she was wanted, even if she wasn't planned. Even if her father never gets to meet her. Jakob's vision blurred as he read the name Rebecca had chosen for their daughter, Sarah, the same name he'd given his wife 6 years later, though he'd told himself it was simply because he liked the sound of it. Now he wondered if his subconscious had been carrying the guilt all along. If he'd been trying to honor the daughter he'd never known he had by giving her name to the woman who'd helped him build a different kind of life. The morning sun had climbed higher while he read, sending shafts of light through the broken windows that illuminated dust motes dancing in the still air. Jakob closed the journal carefully and tucked it inside his coat, next to his heart. He had more questions now than when he'd arrived, but at least he was beginning to understand the shape of the truth Hannah had been trying to show him. His granddaughter. The thought was still too large, too overwhelming to fully comprehend. But it was beginning to feel less impossible, and more like a gift he'd never known he'd been given. The Lancaster County Courthouse stood like a monument to bureaucracy in the center of town, its red brick facade weathered by decades of Pennsylvania winters and summers. Jakob had passed this building countless times in his 70 years, but had never had reason to venture inside, until now. The weight of Rebecca's journal in his coat pocket felt heavier than lead as he climbed the stone steps, each footfall echoing his growing certainty that the answers he needed lay buried in official records. The records office occupied the basement level, accessed through a maze of hallways that smelled of old paper and industrial cleaning solution. The clerk behind the desk, a woman perhaps Ruth's age with kind eyes magnified by thick glasses, looked up from her computer screen as Jakob approached. "How can I help you today?" she asked, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone who'd spent years helping people navigate the mysteries of government documentation. "I'm looking for birth records," Jakob said, then cleared his throat when the words came out rougher than he'd intended. "From 1995, a child named Sarah Mitchell." The clerk's fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Do you have a specific date?" Birth records from that year are all digitized now, but a date would narrow the search considerably, Jakob calculated quickly in his head. If Rebecca had been 8 weeks pregnant in August 1994, the baby would have been born sometime in late March or early April 1995. "April," he said. "Probably early April. Relationship to the child?" the clerk asked, her tone remaining professionally neutral, even as her eyes registered Jakob's plain clothes and obvious Amish background. "I believe I was her father," Jakob replied, the words feeling strange and true and terrifying all at once. The woman's expression softened slightly. "Let me see what I can find." While she worked, Jakob studied the framed photographs on the walls, images of the county's history, buildings that had stood for centuries alongside others that had been torn down and replaced. Time moved differently here among these official records, measured not in seasons or harvests, but in the careful documentation of births, deaths, marriages, and divorces that marked the passage of human lives. "Here we are," the clerk said, turning her monitor so Jakob could see the screen. "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, born April 3rd, 1995. Mother listed as Rebecca Ann Mitchell. Father," she paused, glancing up at Jakob with curiosity. "Father listed as unknown." The words hit Jakob like a physical blow. Unknown. Rebecca had protected him even in official documents, had shielded him from any legal or social consequences of their relationship. She could have named him, could have demanded support or at least acknowledgement, but she'd chosen to face single motherhood rather than expose him to the judgment of both their communities. "Could I get a copy of that record?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll need to see some identification, and you'll need to fill out a request form, since you're not listed as the father of record." The clerk's tone had grown more cautious, clearly aware that she was navigating potentially sensitive territory. Jakob produced his state ID and filled out the paperwork with hands that shook slightly. As he waited for the copy to print, the clerk continued her search with the thoroughness of someone who understood that families were often more complicated than official records suggested. "There's a marriage certificate here too," she said, studying her screen with renewed interest. "Sarah Mitchell married a David Henderson in June 2016. She would have been 21 then." Henderson. Jakob's pulse quickened as he made the connection. Ruth's last name was Henderson, which meant she'd been Sarah's mother-in-law, not her stepmother as she'd told him. The pieces were beginning to form a picture that was both clearer and more complex than he'd imagined. "Is there a death certificate for Sarah?" he asked. Though he already suspected what the answer would be, the clerk's fingers moved across the keyboard again, her expression growing more somber. "Sarah Elizabeth Henderson died February 14th, 2023. Cause of death listed as vehicular accident." She looked up at Jakob with genuine sympathy. She was only 27 years old. Jakob accepted the printed documents with hands that had steadied into resolve. The official papers felt different from Rebecca's journal, cooler, more factual, but no less devastating in their implications. His daughter had lived and died without him ever knowing she existed. She'd married, had a child of her own, built a life that had intersected with his only through Ruth's kind heart and a twist of geography that had placed them as neighbors. Outside the courthouse, Jakob sat in his buggy and studied the documents more carefully. Sarah's birth certificate listed her mother's address as a small apartment complex on the outskirts of town, not far from where the county fair had been held that long-ago summer. The marriage certificate showed that she'd taken her husband's name, becoming Sarah Henderson, and listed Ruth Henderson as a witness to the ceremony. But it was Sarah's death certificate that revealed the most devastating detail. Under "survived by," it listed only one name, Hannah Rose Henderson, daughter, age 2. Hannah had lost her mother when she was barely more than a baby, had spent the last 2 years of her short life being raised by her paternal grandmother, while carrying the DNA of a grandfather she'd never been told about. Yet somehow, in ways that defied rational explanation, she'd led Jakob directly to the evidence of their connection. Jakob tucked the documents into his coat beside Rebecca's journal and guided his horse toward home. The afternoon sun slanted through the maple trees that lined the country road, creating patterns of light and shadow that reminded him of the filtering light in the abandoned cabin where Hannah had shown him the photograph. Everything was connected in ways he was only beginning to understand. Threads of relationship and consequence that had been weaving together for decades without his knowledge. When he arrived home, he found Hannah exactly where he'd left her that morning, sitting at his kitchen table, coloring in a book Ruth had packed among her belongings. She looked up when he entered, her dark eyes searching his face with that uncanny perception that seemed to read more than most adults could express in words. "I found some things today," he told her, settling into the chair across from her small form. "Things about your mama and your mama's mama." Hannah set down her crayon and gave him her full attention, waiting with the patience of someone who'd learned that important information often came slowly and required careful listening. "Your grandmother Rebecca," Jakob continued, testing the words carefully, "she was very special to me once, a long time ago. Before you were born, before your mama was born, she and we cared about each other very much." Hannah reached across the table and touched his hand with her small fingers, the gesture so natural and comforting that Jakob felt tears prick at his eyes. This child understood something about connection that went deeper than words or explanations, something that allowed her to offer comfort without needing to fully comprehend the source of pain. "I think," Jakob said, his voice growing stronger with certainty. "That you and I are family in ways that are more important than the ways we're different." Hannah smiled then. Not the small, careful smile he'd seen before, but a wide, bright expression that transformed her entire face and reminded him so strongly of Rebecca that his breath caught in his throat. In that moment, sitting in his quiet kitchen with documents and journals as evidence of a past he'd tried to forget, Jakob realized that grief and guilt could coexist with something that might, eventually, become joy. The phone call came at 6 in the morning, jarring Jakob from the first peaceful sleep he'd experienced since discovering Rebecca's journal. Ruth's voice sounded thin and distant, stretched across the miles between his kitchen and her hospital bed like a wire pulled too tight. "Jakob, I'm so sorry to call this early, but the doctors want to do the surgery sooner than we thought. My heart, it's not responding to the medication the way they hoped." Her words came in careful bursts, as if speaking required more energy than she could easily spare. "It could be another 2 weeks, maybe longer, before I can come home." Jakob glanced toward the stairs, where Hannah still slept. Her small form curled beneath one of Sarah's quilts. In the week since his courthouse visit, he'd begun to see her differently, not just as a child in his temporary care, but as a living connection to a part of himself he'd thought was lost forever. "Don't worry about Hannah," he told Ruth, meaning it more deeply than she could possibly understand. "Take care of yourself. She's safe here." "There's something else," Ruth continued, her voice dropping even lower. "I need to ask you to go through some of Sarah's things at my house. I keep thinking there might be documents you'll need, insurance information, maybe some medical records for Hannah. I have a key hidden under the flower pot by the back door." After Ruth ended the call, Jakob sat in his kitchen watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of gold and pink. The request to go through his daughter's belongings felt like both a gift and a punishment. The chance to know Sarah through the objects she'd left behind, tempered by the knowledge that he was 30 years too late to know her in life. Hannah appeared at the bottom of the stairs as he was finishing his second cup of coffee, her hair tousled from sleep and her favorite blanket trailing behind her like a security banner. She'd grown more comfortable with him over the past few days, allowing their morning routine to develop a rhythm that felt almost natural. "Ruth had to stay at the hospital a bit longer," he told her as she climbed into her chair at the kitchen table. "But she asked me to get some of your mama's things from her house. Would you like to come with me?" Hannah nodded solemnly, then pointed toward the window in the direction of Ruth's property. It occurred to Jakob that this child had already experienced more loss and displacement than most people faced in a lifetime. Yet she met each new development with a resilience that both amazed and broke his heart. Ruth's house was a modest, 2-story colonial painted yellow with white trim, surrounded by the kind of carefully tended garden that spoke of someone who found peace in nurturing growing things. Jakob had helped Ruth with various repairs over the years, a leaky faucet here, a squeaky door there, but he'd never spent time in the spaces where she'd lived her daily life. Inside, the house carried the faint scent of lavender and old wood, with photographs covering nearly every surface. Jakob recognized Ruth and her late husband in various poses spanning decades of marriage. But it was the newer pictures that drew his attention, images of a young woman with dark hair and familiar eyes holding a baby who would grow into the child now standing beside him. "That's your mama," he told Hannah, though he was speaking as much to himself as to her. The woman in the photographs looked remarkably like Rebecca, but with a gentleness around her eyes that spoke of contentment rather than the restless energy he remembered from her mother. Hannah touched one of the pictures gently, tracing her mother's face with a fingertip worn smooth from the habit. Jakob wondered what memories she carried of Sarah, what stories Ruth had told her about the woman who'd given her life and then been taken. Way too soon, Ruth had been specific about where. To find Sarah's belongings, a cedar chest in the guest bedroom that had become a repository for the things too precious to discard but too painful to display. Inside, Jakob found the carefully organized remnants of a life, photo albums, school reports, a wedding dress wrapped in tissue paper, and a manila envelope labeled "Important Documents" in Sarah's neat handwriting. The envelope contained the expected items: birth certificates, social security cards, insurance policies, but also something that made Jacob's hands shake as he held it. At the bottom of the stack was a letter addressed to him, written in the same careful script as the label on the envelope. "Dear Jakob Stoltzfus," the letter began, and Jakob had to sit down on Ruth's guest bed to continue reading. "I don't know if you'll ever see this letter, or if Ruth will ever have reason to give it to you, but I needed to write it anyway. My name is Sarah Henderson, but I was born Sarah Mitchell. My mother's name was Rebecca, and she told me before she died that you were my father." Jakob's vision blurred as he continued reading. Hannah's small presence beside him, the only thing anchoring him to the present moment. "I want you to know that I'm not angry. Mom explained about your world and hers, about the choices you both had to make when you were young. She said you never knew about me, and I believe that's true because I could see in her eyes that she never stopped loving you, even after she married my stepfather and we moved to California when I was 5. The letter went on to describe Sarah's life, her education, her marriage to David Henderson, her joy when Hannah was born. But it was the final paragraph that broke Jacob's heart completely. "I've thought about contacting you many times over the years, especially after Hannah was born, and I started wondering about the grandfather she'll never know. But I also understand that your life is built on foundations that might not have room for complications from the past. If something happens to me, though, and if fate or God brings you into Hannah's life somehow, I want you to know that she is yours as much as she is mine. She has your stubbornness and your way of seeing the world through careful eyes. She would be lucky to have you love her, and you would be lucky to know how bright and brave and special she is." Jakob set the letter carefully on his lap and looked at Hannah, who was studying his face with that intense attention he'd come to recognize as her way of processing emotions too complex for words. Sarah had known about him all along, had carried his identity like a secret gift, and had somehow arranged for Hannah to end up in Ruth's care, in a place where their paths would inevitably cross. "Your mama knew about me," he told Hannah softly. "She wanted us to find each other." Hannah climbed onto the bed beside him and leaned against his shoulder, her small body warm and trusting in a way that spoke of acceptance beyond understanding. As Jakob held his daughter's letter in one hand and felt his granddaughter's steady breathing against his side, he realized that love had been working in ways too intricate for his limited vision to comprehend, weaving connections across decades and through loss to bring him exactly what he needed when he was finally ready to receive it. Jakob had never imagined he would find himself in a medical laboratory, providing a saliva sample for something called a DNA test. The sterile environment felt alien after a lifetime spent in workshops that smelled of wood shavings and fields that carried the scent of growing things. But Hannah's future hung in the balance, and he needed more than faith and intuition to convince the authorities that this child belonged with him. The technician, a young woman with kind eyes and efficient movements, explained that results would be available within 5 business days. Jakob nodded, though the concept of reducing his connection to Hannah to a series of numbers and percentages seemed to diminish something sacred. Still, he understood that the English world required different kinds of proof than the Amish community, where relationships were built on trust, observation, and the gradual accumulation of shared experience. While he waited for the scientific confirmation of what his heart already knew, Jakob returned to the cabin one final time. The structure seemed even more fragile than before, as if the weight of the secrets it had held for so long was finally causing it to surrender completely to time and weather. But something drew him back to that shadowed corner, where Hannah had first led him to discover the photograph. This time, He brought proper tools, a flashlight, a small crowbar, and the patient methodology of someone who understood that the most important discoveries often lay beneath the obvious. The wooden crate had yielded its primary treasures, but the floorboards around it showed signs of disturbance that suggested there might be more to find. Working carefully to avoid destabilizing the already compromised structure, Jakob pried up the boards that flanked the crate's original position. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from decades of moisture and decay, he found another package, this one sealed with wax and marked with Rebecca's distinctive handwriting. For Jakob, when he's ready to understand, the label read in faded ink that had somehow remained legible despite the passage of years. Inside the waterproof wrapping, Jakob found a second letter from Rebecca. Not a journal entry this time, but a direct communication written with the certainty that someday, somehow, he would find it. The paper was different too, heavier and more formal, as if she'd purchased special stationery for this final message. "My dearest Jake," the letter began, and Jakob could almost hear her voice in the carefully formed words. "If you're reading this, it means you've found your way back to our special place, and probably that you've discovered the truth about Sarah. I've been leaving pieces of our story here for 27 years, hoping that fate would guide you to them when the time was right." Jakob's hands trembled as he continued reading. "By the light filtering through the cabin's broken windows, I need you to know that I forgive you for leaving, because I understand now what I couldn't understand then, that love isn't always enough to overcome the weight of family and tradition and the fear of disappointing everyone who shaped us into who we are. You were 19, Jake. We both were. We thought love was simple, but we learned it's the most complicated thing in the world." The letter went on to describe Rebecca's life after Jakob left. Her struggles as a single mother, her eventual move to California when Sarah was 5, her marriage to a kind man named Robert who'd raised Sarah as his own daughter but had never tried to replace the father she'd never known. "Sarah always knew about you," Rebecca wrote. "I showed her the photograph when she was old enough to understand, told her stories about the summer we spent planning a future that wasn't meant to be. She never blamed you, Jake. She said once that she thought it was romantic. Having a father who was like a character from a story, someone who existed in her life, but also beyond it. Like a guardian angel she couldn't see, but knew was there. But it was the letter's final revelation that stopped Jakob's breath entirely. Sarah met David Henderson when she was 20, and they were married within a year. Ruth Henderson became the mother-in-law Sarah had always wished for, and when Hannah was born, Ruth loved her like she was her own granddaughter. But Sarah worried about what would happen if something happened to her. David traveled for work, and she was afraid Hannah would be alone in the world if tragedy struck. Jakob's vision blurred as he read the next paragraph. "Sarah asked me to make a promise before she died. Jake, she made me swear that if anything happened to her, I would find a way to bring Hannah to you. She said a child should know her grandfather, should understand where she comes from and who her people are. But she also said it had to happen naturally, that forcing it would only hurt everyone involved." The letter's final paragraph made Jakob sit down hard on the cabin's rotting floor. "Ruth Henderson has known who you are since the day she took custody of Hannah. She knew because Sarah told her, because Sarah showed her the photograph and explained about her biological father who lived just a few miles away. Ruth chose to move to that house beside your property on purpose. Jake, she brought Hannah there hoping you would discover the connection on your own, hoping that love would find a way to bring you together without the complications that would come from forced explanations." Jakob's mind reeled as the implications of Rebecca's revelation settled into place. Ruth had known all along. Every conversation they'd had about Hannah's care, every moment of seeming coincidence that had led to this point, all of it had been carefully orchestrated by a woman who'd been waiting for him to discover what she'd been hoping he would find. The sound of approaching footsteps on the path outside made Jakob look up from the letter. Through the cabin's open doorway, he saw Ruth herself walking slowly toward the clearing, her hospital bracelet still visible on her thin wrist, but her color better than it had been in days. "I thought I might find you here," she said as she stepped through the doorway, her eyes taking in the disturbed floorboards and the letter in Jakob's hands. "The doctors released me this morning. They said I was healing faster than they expected. That sometimes the heart mends itself when it has something important to live for." Jakob stared at her, seeing her clearly for the first time since she'd appeared on his doorstep asking him to care for Hannah. Ruth Henderson, who'd moved next to his property not by chance, but by design. Ruth Henderson, who'd known exactly who he was from the moment she'd knocked on his door. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Since the day Sarah died," Ruth replied, settling carefully onto an overturned crate that might have been the twin to the one that had held Rebecca's photograph. "She made me promise to bring Hannah here to give her a chance to know her grandfather, but she also made me promise not to force it. She said the connection had to be real, had to develop naturally, or it wouldn't be worth anything." Ruth's eyes were gentle but direct as she continued. "I've been waiting for you to put the pieces together. Jakob, waiting for you to discover what I already knew, that this child is yours as much as she's mine, that she belongs with you in ways that have nothing to do with law and everything to do with love." Outside the cabin, Jakob could hear Hannah's voice calling his name, her clear tones carrying through the forest like a bell calling him home. Ruth smiled at the sound, the expression transforming her lined face with something that looked like profound relief. "She's been waiting too," Ruth said softly. "Waiting for her Dawdy to understand that some gifts come disguised as accidents, and some families are built by faith instead of blood." She paused, studying his face with the same careful attention Hannah had inherited. "The question now is what you want to do with the truth you've been given." Ruth reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a manila envelope, its edges worn from handling and its contents thick enough to suggest official documentation. The gesture was deliberate, careful, as if she were presenting something both precious and potentially explosive. "These are custody papers," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decisions made in sleepless hospital nights. "Legal guardianship documents naming you as Hannah's primary caregiver in the event of my death or incapacitation." She paused, watching Jakob's face for his reaction. "I had them drawn up 6 months ago after my first heart episode. I wanted to be sure Hannah would be safe, that she'd be with family who would love her unconditionally." Jakob stared at the envelope as if it contained something dangerous, rather than the legal framework for the life he'd begun to imagine. The DNA test results had arrived that morning, confirming with scientific certainty what his heart had already accepted. But this was Ruth asking him to step fully into a role that would change not just his life, but his standing in the community that had shaped him for 7 decades. "Ruth," he began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was offering and what it would require of him. "I know it's complicated," she said gently. "Your community, your faith, the questions people will ask. But Sarah was specific about this, Jakob. She said Hannah belongs with her grandfather, that she has a right to know where she comes from and who her people are." The sound of Hannah's voice grew closer as she navigated the forest path with the confidence of someone who'd walked it many times before. In the weeks since Ruth's hospitalization, the child had flourished under Jakob's care, speaking more freely, laughing more often, displaying the kind of trust that only develops between people who feel safe with each other. "Dawdy," Hannah's voice called from just outside the clearing. "Ich bin hier." "I'm here," the Pennsylvania Dutch phrase emerging from her lips as naturally as if she'd been speaking it all her life. Ruth's eyebrows rose at the sound of the child's perfect pronunciation. "She's learned the language?" "She seems to have always known it." Jakob replied, still trying to understand how a 4-year-old raised in English could have absorbed the linguistic patterns of his people so completely. It's as if, he paused, searching for words to describe something that defied rational explanation, as if she remembers it from somewhere else. Hannah appeared in the doorway then, her face brightening when she saw Ruth sitting in the cabin where their story had begun. She ran to her grandmother and wrapped her arms around Ruth's waist, chattering in a mixture of English and Pennsylvania Dutch that made both adults smile despite the serious conversation they'd been having. "Ruth is feeling better," Jakob told Hannah, though it was clear from the child's reaction that she'd already assessed and accepted this information with the pragmatic resilience he'd come to admire in her. "Gut," Hannah replied, then looked between the two adults with the perceptive gaze that suggested she understood more about their conversation than her age should have allowed. "We go home now?" The simple question carried layers of meaning that made Jakob's chest tight with emotion. Home, but which home? Ruth's house where Hannah had lived for 2 years, or his farmhouse where she'd begun calling him Dawdy and learning the rhythms of a life built around faith and tradition. Ruth seemed to understand the complexity behind Hannah's innocent question. "Well, that's what we need to talk about, sweetheart. About where home is going to be and who's going to take care of you." Over the next several days, Jakob found himself caught between two worlds in ways he'd never experienced, even during his Rumspringa. The legal papers Ruth had prepared were thorough and official, but they meant nothing without the approval of his community, and that approval was far from guaranteed. Bishop Samuel requested a meeting with Jakob, not in the informal setting of his kitchen, but in the more formal context of the bishop's home, with other church elders present. The gravity of the situation was evident in the careful way the men arranged themselves around the kitchen table, their faces reflecting concern mixed with genuine affection for Jakob, but also worry about the precedent his situation might set. "We understand your heart in this matter," Bishop Samuel began, his tone respectful but measured. "The child is your blood, and blood calls to blood in ways that don't always follow the patterns we might prefer. But we also have to consider what bringing an English child into our community would mean for everyone, not just for you." Elder Yoda, a man Jakob had known since childhood, leaned forward in his chair. "The child would need to be raised in our faith, taught our ways. She would need to understand that if she chooses to remain with us, it means accepting a life that's very different from the one she might have in the English world. She already speaks our language," Jakob said, though he knew that linguistic ability wasn't the primary concern these men were expressing. "She works with her hands, shows respect for tradition. Yesterday she helped me milk the cows without being asked, knew instinctively how to approach them so they wouldn't be skittish." Elder Miller nodded thoughtfully. "These are good signs. But Jakob, you must also consider what this choice would mean for you. You would be responsible not just for raising a child at 70 years old, but for raising a child who bridges two worlds. That's a burden that would require wisdom beyond what any of us possess." The conversation continued for hours, moving from practical considerations to theological questions about adoption, family obligations, and the community's responsibility to support its members in difficult decisions. Through it all, Jakob felt the weight of Hannah's future pressing down on him like a stone. These men weren't his opponents. They were trying to help him navigate a situation that had no clear precedent in their tradition. "We'll need to put it to the community," Bishop Samuel finally said, as evening shadows began lengthening across the farmland, visible through the kitchen windows. "This decision affects more than just your family, Jakob. It affects how we understand ourselves as a people, how we balance our commitment to our own ways with our obligation to love and care for children who need homes." Jakob returned to his own house that evening to find Hannah and Ruth sitting at his kitchen table, sharing a simple dinner and speaking in the mixture of English and Pennsylvania Dutch that had become Hannah's natural language. The scene looked so right, so much like the family dinners he'd imagined but never experienced, that it broke his heart to think it might not be permanent. "How did the meeting go?" Ruth asked, though his expression probably told her everything she needed to know. "They want the community to vote," Jakob replied. Settling into his usual chair and accepting the plate Hannah pushed toward him with the unconscious generosity of someone who'd already claimed him as family. "It's not just about whether I can care for Hannah. It's about whether the community can accept responsibility for raising a child who comes from outside our traditions." Ruth nodded slowly, understanding the complexity of what he was facing. "What will you tell them?" "When they ask what you want," Jakob looked at Hannah, who was listening to their conversation with the serious attention she gave to everything that might affect her future. This child who'd led him back to his own past, who spoke his language without being taught, who'd filled the empty spaces in his house and his heart with a presence that felt both miraculous and inevitable. "I'll tell them the truth," he said finally, "that love makes its own traditions, and that some families are built by choice rather than circumstance. I'll tell them that Hannah belongs here because she chooses to belong here. And that's the strongest foundation any family can have." Hannah smiled at his words, then reached across the table to touch his hand with her small fingers. "Ich liebe dich, Dodi," she said softly. "I love you, grandfather," the words carrying all the hope and trust and stubborn certainty that had brought them to this moment. Outside, the sun was setting over the rolling hills of Lancaster County, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber that reminded Jakob of the light filtering through the cabin windows on the day Hannah had first shown him the photograph that changed everything. Tomorrow would bring the community meeting that would determine their future. But tonight, sitting at his kitchen table with the family he'd never expected to have, Jakob felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the profound peace that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be. The community gathering took place in the Yoda barn, the same weathered structure where Jakob had attended countless meetings over the decades, discussions about crop rotation, barn raisings, marriages, and disciplinary matters that required collective wisdom. But never before had he sat in the circle of wooden chairs, knowing that his own future hung in the balance of his neighbor's decision. 37 adults filled the barn that evening, representing every family in their district. The women sat on one side, their prayer coverings creating a sea of white against the dark wool of their dresses. The men occupied the opposite side, their faces reflecting the serious concentration they brought to all matters of community importance. At the center of the circle sat an old wooden ballot box that had been used for church decisions since Jakob's grandfather's time, a simple pine construction with a hinged lid and a slot wide enough for folded papers. Bishop Samuel stood as the last rays of evening light filtered through the barn's high windows, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. "We're gathered tonight to consider a matter that affects our understanding of family, faith, and responsibility," he began, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of guiding his people through difficult decisions. "Jakob Stoltzfus has asked for our blessing to raise his granddaughter Hannah, a child who comes to us from the English world." A murmur rippled through the assembly, not disapproval exactly, but the sound of people processing information that challenged their usual categories. Jakob felt Hannah's small hand slip into his, her presence beside him both comforting and terrifying. Ruth sat on his other side, having been granted permission to attend as Hannah's current guardian, though she would have no voice in the final decision. "Before we discuss this matter," the bishop continued, "Jakob has asked to speak to the community about his intentions and his understanding of what this choice would mean." Jakob rose slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him as he faced the people who'd known him all his life. These were the neighbors who'd helped him build his house when he'd married Sarah, who'd brought food during her final illness, who'd supported him through 3 years of grief and isolation. Now he was asking them to support him in something unprecedented, the adoption of a child, whose very presence would change the nature of their community. "Most of you know that I never had children of my own," he began, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Sarah and I, we tried for years, prayed for years, accepted finally that some blessings weren't meant for us." He paused, looking around the circle at faces he'd known since childhood. "But 3 weeks ago, I discovered that I'd been a father all along, and a grandfather too. This child—" He gestured toward Hannah, who was watching the proceedings with her characteristic serious attention. "She's the daughter of my daughter, born from a relationship I had during my Rumspringa, before I joined the church." Elder Yoda raised his hand slightly, a gesture that requested permission to speak. When the bishop nodded, the old man stood and addressed Jakob directly. "We understand the pull of blood, Jakob, but this child comes from outside our faith, raised in ways that are foreign to our traditions. How can we be sure she'll accept our teachings, our restrictions, our way of life?" Before Jakob could respond, Hannah stood up beside him. The sight of this small figure rising to address a room full of adults created a moment of surprised silence, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Ik verstehe," Hannah said in clear Pennsylvania Dutch, her child's voice carrying through the barn with startling confidence. "I understand. Ich will hier bleiben. I want to stay here." The murmur that followed her words was different this time, surprised, but also moved by the clarity of her statement and the perfect accent with which she'd delivered it. Several of the women exchanged glances that seemed to acknowledge something significant about a child who could speak their language without formal instruction. Hannah remained standing, looking around the circle with the same direct gaze she'd given Jakob on the morning they'd first met. Then she did something that surprised everyone present, including Jakob. She began to speak about her mother in a mixture of English and Pennsylvania Dutch that suggested she'd been thinking carefully about what she wanted to say. "My mama told Ruth Grossmummy that I have 2 families," she said, the Pennsylvania Dutch word for grandmother emerging naturally in her speech. "The family that made me and the family that would love me. She said Dordy Jakob is both. He made my mama and now he loves me." She looked directly at Bishop Samuel with the fearless attention of someone who'd never learned to be intimidated by authority. "I choose to stay with my Dordy. I choose to learn your ways because they are his ways. And he is mine." The silence that followed Hannah's words was profound, the kind of quiet that comes when something fundamental has shifted in a room full of people. Jakob saw tears in several women's eyes, and even some of the men were studying their hands with the careful attention they gave to emotions too large for easy expression. Bishop Samuel nodded slowly, acknowledging both Hannah's words and their impact on the assembly. "The child has spoken for herself," he said formally. "Now we must decide whether we can speak for her as well, whether we're prepared to accept responsibility for raising someone who will always bridge 2 worlds." The wooden ballot box, weighted in the center of the circle like a door that, once opened, would change everything for everyone present. The voting process followed the careful ritual that had governed community decisions for generations. Each adult received a small piece of paper and retreated to a private corner of the barn to make their choice in silence. The options were simple. Yes, for accepting Hannah into their community with Jakob as her guardian, or no, for maintaining that such an arrangement would compromise their traditional boundaries. Jakob watched his neighbors move through the familiar process, trying to read their expressions for clues about their decisions. Mary Byler, who'd been Sarah's closest friend, caught his eye and offered a small, encouraging smile. Aaron Miller, his oldest friend, nodded once in a way that seemed to convey support. But others, Elder Fisher, who'd always been strict about maintaining separation from English influences, and young Samuel Yoda, who worried about setting precedents that might complicate future decisions, avoided his gaze entirely. Hannah remained beside Jakob throughout the voting, her presence both steadying and anxiety-inducing. She seemed to understand the gravity of what was happening, though Jakob wondered if a 4-year-old could truly comprehend that these adults were deciding whether she would be allowed to stay in the only place that had felt like home since her mother's deaths. The last voter dropped their folded paper into the wooden box. Bishop Samuel carried it to the front of the barn and set it on a small table beneath the single oil lamp that provided light for the counting. The ritual of tallying votes was always done publicly, with witnesses from both sides to ensure fairness and transparency. "Before we count," the bishop said, his voice carrying the weight of the decision they were all facing, "I want to remind everyone that whatever we decide tonight, we decide in love. This child deserves our kindness regardless of the outcome, and Jakob deserves our support as a member of our community who's facing one of the most difficult choices of his life." The first slip of paper read, "Yes," written in the careful script Jakob recognized as belonging to Mary Byler. The second read "No" in equally careful letters. As the bishop continued opening papers and sorting them into 2 piles, the votes seemed to alternate between support and opposition with painful regularity. Jakob felt his chest tighten with each "no" that joined the growing pile. These weren't strangers rejecting his granddaughter. These were people who'd known him all his life, who'd shared his sorrows and celebrations, who'd helped shape the man he'd become. Their opposition wasn't born of cruelty, but of genuine concern about preserving the boundaries that had protected their way of life for centuries. Halfway through the counting, Ruth reached over and placed her hand on Jakob's arm, offering silent support. Hannah had grown very still beside him, her small body tense with the kind of anxiety that children feel when adults around them are stressed, even if they don't fully understand the source. 18 yes, 15 no, Bishop Samuel announced as he opened the penultimate ballot. 1 vote remained in the box, the deciding vote that would determine whether Jakob and Hannah could build their future together within the community that had raised him. The final slip of paper seemed to take forever to unfold. Bishop Samuel's expression remained carefully neutral as he read the single word written there, but Jakob thought he detected the slightest softening around the man's eyes before he spoke. 19 yes, 15 no, the bishop announced. The community has decided to accept Hannah as Jakob's granddaughter and to support their family within our fellowship. The relief that flooded through Jakob was so intense, it left him dizzy. Around the barn, people began standing and moving toward him and Hannah, offering congratulations and welcome. But it was Hannah's reaction that affected him most deeply. She looked up at him with eyes bright with tears she was too young to fully understand, then threw her arms around his waist with the complete trust of someone who'd never doubted this outcome. "The decision comes with conditions," Bishop Samuel continued, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the conversations that had begun around the barn. "Hannah will be raised in our faith and traditions, but she'll also be taught about her English heritage so she can make an informed choice when she reaches adulthood. Jakob will have the support of the entire community in this endeavor, but the community will also have the right to provide guidance and correction when needed." Jakob nodded, understanding that he was accepting not just guardianship of Hannah, but partnership with his neighbors in raising a child who would always be unique within their world. It was a responsibility that both honored and humbled him. As the formal meeting dissolved into smaller conversations and quiet celebrations, Hannah tugged on Jakob's sleeve and pointed toward her coat pocket. She withdrew a folded piece of paper, not one of the official ballots, but something she'd prepared herself. When Jakob unfolded it, he found a drawing done in the careful, unsteady lines of a young child's hand. It showed 2 figures holding hands beneath a tree, with a house in the background and what might have been chickens scattered around a yard. At the bottom, in letters that looked like they'd been copied from somewhere else, she'd written, "Hannah and Dawdy home." Jakob knelt down to Hannah's level, and pulled her into a hug that felt like both an ending and a beginning. This child who'd led him back to his past had just been given permission to help him build his future. And for the first time in years, that future looked bright enough to believe in. 6 months later, the sound of Hannah's laughter echoed through Jakob's workshop as she carefully guided a small handplane across a piece of maple wood, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. The jewelry box they'd been working on together was nearly finished. Her project, though Jakob's guidance had helped shape every joint and smooth every surface. "We schön," Hannah said, examining her work with the critical eye she'd inherited from her grandfather. How beautiful. Her Pennsylvania Dutch had become completely natural now, flowing seamlessly with English in conversations that reflected her growing comfort with inhabiting 2 worlds simultaneously. Jakob smiled at her assessment, remembering how his own grandmother had taught him to find beauty in the simplest objects when they were crafted with care and intention. "Your mama would be proud," he told her, as he did whenever Hannah accomplished something that showcased the determination and gentle spirit that seemed to flow through the women in their family line. The mention of Sarah no longer brought the sharp pain it had in those first difficult weeks after the community vote. Instead, it carried the bittersweet comfort of acknowledging someone whose presence was felt even in her absence. Hannah had begun asking questions about her mother and grandmother Rebecca, and Jakob had learned to answer them with the kind of honest affection that honored both women's roles in bringing them together. Ruth visited twice a week now, her health stable enough to allow her to maintain her own household while remaining an active part of Hannah's life. The arrangement worked beautifully. Hannah had the security of her relationship with Jakob while maintaining the connection to Ruth that provided continuity with her earlier life. The 3 of them had become a family unit that defied traditional categories but functioned with the kind of natural harmony that suggested it was exactly what each of them needed. The community's acceptance of their unusual situation had grown stronger over the months. Hannah's eagerness to learn their customs, combined with her obvious happiness in Jakob's care, had won over even some of the initial skeptics. She helped with farm chores with the enthusiasm of someone who found joy in useful work, attended church services with the quiet attention their tradition valued, and had begun learning to read Pennsylvania Dutch with the same natural facility she'd shown for speaking it. "Dordie," Hannah said, setting down her plane and looking at him with the serious expression that usually preceded her most important questions. "Will you tell me about the cabin again?" It had become her favorite story, the tale of how she'd led him down the forest path to discover the photograph that had changed both their lives. Jakob suspected she asked for the retelling, not because she'd forgotten any details, but because she found comfort in hearing how their connection had been revealed through her own mysterious instincts. "You walked through those trees like you'd traveled that path 100 times before," Jakob said, beginning the familiar narrative. "Straight to that old cabin, straight to the corner where your grandmother Rebecca had left the photograph waiting for us to find." "And you were scared," Hannah added, as she always did at this point in the story. "I was," Jakob admitted. "Scared of what the truth might mean, scared of loving someone and losing them again." He paused in his work to meet her gaze directly. "But you weren't scared at all. You knew we belonged together before I did." Hannah nodded solemnly, then brightened as she returned to her woodworking. These conversations about their origin story seemed to anchor her, providing a narrative framework that helped her understand her place in the complex web of relationships that had brought her to this life. In the corner of the workshop, Jakob had been working on a new project during the quiet hours after Hannah went to bed each night. The wooden cradle was nearly complete now, hand-carved from cherry wood with joints that would last for generations. It wasn't for any immediate need, but rather a statement of faith in the future, a tangible expression of hope that someday Hannah would have children of her own who would grow up knowing both sides of their heritage. The cradle represented everything he'd learned about love's ability to create families across time and circumstance. When Hannah was old enough to understand its significance, he would tell her that he'd made it as a promise, that the love which had brought them together would continue flowing forward, creating connections and healing wounds for generations yet to come. As evening approached and they cleaned their tools together, Jakob reflected on how profoundly his life had changed since that morning, when Ruth had appeared on his doorstep with a silent child who seemed to hold secrets in her dark eyes. The loneliness that had defined his existence since Sarah's death had been replaced by the daily joys and challenges of raising a granddaughter who brought energy and purpose to every corner of his previously quiet world. "Time for supper," he told Hannah, who was carefully arranging her tools in the small wooden box he'd made for her. Another project that had emerged from their shared love of creating useful, beautiful things with their hands. "Can we have soup?" she asked, slipping her small hand into his as they walked toward the house where warm light spilled from the kitchen windows onto the darkening yard. "We can have whatever you'd like," Jakob replied, meaning it in ways that encompassed far more than just their evening meal. This child who'd led him back to his own past had taught him that love multiplies rather than diminishes when it's shared, that families can be built through choice and faith as surely as through blood and tradition. As they stepped into the warmth of their kitchen, where the wooden cross he'd carved for his late wife Sarah still sat beside his place at the table, Jakob offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the mysterious ways love finds to heal old wounds and create new beginnings. Outside, the same woodland path that had brought them together wound through the darkness toward the cabin where their story had begun. But inside, grandfather and granddaughter prepared another simple meal in the home they'd chosen to build together. A home where the deepest wounds could indeed heal through the smallest hands reaching out to touch them.